This is the Triratna Dharma training course for Mitras. Compiled by Vedanya and produced by Sangaruchi. Music by Sarvadarshan. Hello, my name's Sangaruchi. This course is usually offered in Triratna Buddhist centres to small groups. I'm producing an audio version for anyone who can't get to a centre. Please listen to episode 1.1.0 as this gives an introduction. The course is narrated in text sessions, and in a subsequent question and answer session, I respond to anything people have sent me. Do send any questions. Year 1, Part 1, Week 8 of the Dharma Training Course for Mitras. 1.1.8 The Dharma, Many Dimensions. Questions and answers. Does enlightenment feel like it's getting closer to you? So I'm going to take this as a personal question to me. Yes. Often in the Pali Canon, it's referred to as attaining enlightenment. Like it is a thing that you add to yourself or that you get. But another way that it's put is stream entry, in that there is a flow of reality, there is a way that reality is, and there's a movement in reality. And enlightenment is not a thing that you get or that you have. Enlightenment is aligning yourself with that movement. And the image that comes to me is one of continually struggling against the flow. One of always trying to go in the direction that reality doesn't want me to go in. I want to be permanent and all things are impermanent. I want to have a fixed, known, stable sense of self, and all things are insubstantial. I only really want to have pleasure, but pain is an inherent part of life, and swimming against that is just really difficult. Like water's quite heavy. Trying to move against even quite a slow current is actually really difficult. The idea of stream entry is that you just lift your feet off the bottom and you find that it carries you. It carries you downstream, it carries you in a direction. And you move along with the flow. That's an image, that's quite a intuitive image. In terms of my actual experience, there's not really anything that I could, there's very few things that I could say this particular thing in my life or this particular experience was a result of what I've learned or a change in my character that I know I wouldn't have had otherwise if I hadn't have started practicing. I'm less easy to anger now, I think, but to what degree that's practice and to what degree that's because I'm older and just don't have as much energy to get angry about things anymore, I don't know. I think my conception of enlightenment is more subtle now, and it's more about mystery and fascination and possibility. Whereas to begin with, or fairly early on, it was a very clear sense of I know what enlightenment is and I'm going to have it done by Christmas. It was definitely a thing I was trying to get. And so if taking the question very literally, does enlightenment feel like it's getting closer to you? In some ways, it feels like it's getting further away, because to begin with, I had a rather naive and little understanding of what enlightenment was. And so it felt quite close. It felt like I could almost reach it. But what it was probably wasn't that useful. Whereas now it somehow feels further away than it's ever been, but I'm just not so bothered somehow. One thing that I do think has changed, initially my idea of enlightenment was that my experience would change, that my given experience would change, that I would make myself stop thinking, that I would make myself be happy. I would essentially confine the limitations of my experience to things that were good and nice and that I wanted, and then I would be happy. Essentially, I'd turn the world into something that was nicer around me. And so I kind of wanted my experience to change. When I thought of enlightenment, I thought that it would be a radically different experience. I think it's gone from an experience-based value system to more of a response-based value system. I think probably several years ago, if somebody asked me how I was, I would base my answer on my experience. So if I felt low, I would say, oh, I'm not doing good. Or if I'd been working a lot or doing something that I didn't want to do, or if I'd been ill, or if I'd been in pain or quite upset, again, it would be, I haven't been doing well. But really, none of that is about me. All of that's my given experience. So more and more, if somebody asks me how I am, I think I'm increasingly responding to tell them my participation. That's the value system that I'm more focused on now. So, how are you? Oh, well, I've been very ill, but I've still managed to keep a good diet. And I've managed to hand on all my responsibilities. Or, how are you? Well, I'm feeling a bit depressed, but on the whole, I've managed to keep in my head that this is impermanent. And it's kind of like a much more empowering way of relating to my experience, I think. And it's not always like that. I'm not saying that I've gone from one to the other, but I think there's probably a general trend of me identifying with the things that I do as opposed to identifying with what the world does to me. Because I don't really have any choice what the world does to me. I only really need to be concerned with my response. And that's a radical shift in perspective. How does an image convey the Dharma? I suppose there's a few categories in images. There's the aesthetics of the image. So something can just be beautiful. You know, the colours can work, or the shape, or the way something's put together. And a beautiful object and a beautiful environment, it just encourages interest and awareness and subtlety. Being in a beautiful environment makes mindfulness easy and pleasurable. So I think just aesthetics can convey the Dharma. It can convey a mindset that's conducive to the truth. There's the intuitive angle as well in terms of content. So when you walk into a Buddhist center, the biggest room in the place has a statue right at the front of the room that's facing you, and it's pretty big, intuitively tells you that that image has value. And if it's covered in gold, or it's placed on a pedestal, or it's adorned with flowers, again, it means that it's valued and that it's maintained. Fresh flowers means that it's continually maintained. That image does convey something to you. I mean, in a church, there is a torture device as the central image. It's a cross. There's somebody being crucified on a cross, and that does convey something strong. And it conveys something different to somebody sat in meditation, who's on a flower, sat on a flower. And the mudra that they have, like the hand gestures, although most Westerners don't really know what particular hand gestures are. I mean, we did a class on mudras a while ago where we just showed the mudra, the hand symbol, and generally people didn't get them straight away. But invariably, after a short period of 10 or 20 people being in the class, fearlessness or generosity or contemplation were mentioned, as a stream of words that came up. That there is an intuitive communication with some images. Then the intuitive sort of blends into the symbolic, which I think is a more structured and learned imaginative language. So, for example, Padmasambhava has a feather in his cap. You probably wouldn't intuitively realise this, but it symbolises death because it's a vulture feather, and in Tibet, people have sky burials, which is where your body is left out on the mountain, and vultures take your body to bits. It's really graphic. That feather is right at the very top of his cap. It symbolises death. It symbolises impermanence. And because it's at the very top of his cap, it means that kind of takes primacy. All things are subject to decay. And then I suppose there's conceptual art or graphics, which is not really imagery in terms of art, but just more in terms of conveying ideas. So the Wheel of Life is a good example of that, where there's little images, and each image in the Wheel of Life going around the edge conveys a particular function of mind or a particular process, and they all go around in a circle, and the images have an emotive quality to them. Like one of them is a guy getting an arrow in his eyeball, which is, again, very graphic. It's quite a strong image, but it's easy for me to remember that. About 15 years ago, when I first come to Buddhism, I made a big poster called the Map of Terms, because I wanted to get all of the concepts that I knew in one place and place them relative to each other. And a lot of it is text, but there are images and there are graphics in there, and just the way that the whole thing is laid out spatially turns all the little jigsaw pieces of the Dharma, which I was picking up in individual classes, it puts them into a cohesive whole. Before, it was just like being given individual jigsaw pieces and I didn't know how they went together, whereas this thing was a bit like looking at the box whilst you're trying to put these jigsaw pieces together. So every time I got a new jigsaw piece, I knew kind of where it went and how it fitted into the bigger picture. And even now, when I bring the Dharma to mind or particular formulations of it, I can often see in my mind where on the map of terms that it fits. So that's quite a rational use of image. The other thing is memory retention. So it's generally easier to remember an image than text or a number. So people who do the memory competitions where they have to remember every single card out of a deck, or out of 500 decks of cards, they have a sequence of cards that they remember. And they don't actually remember the 2 of hearts, the 6 of diamonds. They don't remember the numbers. They associate each card with a particular image, with a particular object or a particular place. And they construct a journey from all of those images. And relating, for example, the concept of compassion with a lotus, and you continually do that, that then means something when you look at Padmasambhava, who is sat on a lotus. And if you look at Padmasambhava long enough, you remember what he looks like, all the details, what he wears, what he's holding, where he is, what he's sat on. And everything on that image has a meaning. And you can interact with that image in the same way that you interact and recall significant memories or people in your life. And the other thing that images are good for is that they get me out of my head and get me into my senses. If the Buddha is sitting with you, is that in human form? So that's quite a curious question. Yeah, sometimes. Sometimes I put an extra meditation mat down for him to sit on. Sometimes it's the Buddha that turns up. Sometimes it's Tara. Sometimes it's some other image that might come and sit next to me. That's if I'm letting my imagination sort of unfold. Sometimes I will decide that I'm going to do the meditation Buddhana Sati, and then it is the Buddha. There are lots of different ways you can do it. Some people imagine the Buddha sort of superimposed over them, so that their body is the body of the Buddha, that he is in you as such, or that one of the bodhisattvas is in you or part of you or sharing your body in some way. Like the Buddha doesn't have a body, so you might decide to give him your body for a while. See how he relates to your body. Some people think of the Buddha as sat next to them or facing them. You could even imagine him behind you with his hand on your shoulder. You could maybe view yourself through the Buddha's eyes. I know some people have related to the different jhinas, which are like the archetypal Buddhas. They've related to them through their animals. So Akshobhya's animal is the elephant. Very steady, gentle but powerful beast. You could maybe put yourself 2,500 years ago, imagine yourself in the Buddha's day, what it would have been like to hear him teach, to sit with him, to meditate with him. The one that I've done every now and again is to see the Buddha in my life here and now. So that's like seeing the threads of consequence run through time. If the Buddha had not lived, if the Buddha had never existed, Buddhism wouldn't exist, Triratna wouldn't exist. I probably wouldn't have met all these people that I know. I wouldn't have done these meditations over many years, and what might that look like? How would I be different if I hadn't done all these things and met these people and learned these things? And if I wasn't practicing ethics in this way, maybe I would have made a mess of that meeting last week and 2 years ago and that time when this happened. And you can sort of go through your life and think, the Buddha is present. The consequences of the Buddha's actions are present in just the same way that if you were there 2,500 years ago, he would speak and the consequences of that speech would move through the air and affect your ears and affect your mind, it's no different that he created the Sangha, and the consequences of that decision are now affecting you. It sounds a lot quicker, of course, but the Sangha is just as much the Buddha's participation in the world as his speech is. And you can see what he has done for you in your life, here and now. You know, it's not even imaginative. It's just evident. I'm sure there's lots more, but probably the last one I can think of at the moment is just a sense of love. Comprehending that there has been a consciousness, there has been a person who is truly unconditionally loving. That mind existed and may still exist in some sense, or the consequences of that are still around, can be quite moving. I heard about a guy who had a head injury, lost his sense of self, and was a nightmare to live with. Is losing a sense of self a good idea? No, losing your sense of self is not a good idea. That would be a little bit like saying, I'm not happy with the operating system on my PC, so I'm going to uninstall it. It's just not a good idea. It's better to have a bad operating system than no operating system. Losing your sense of self is a bad idea. Don't do it. However, replacing your operating system with an updated version is a good idea. The human operating system version 1 operates on greed, hatred, and delusion. And if you think that works for you, then keep it installed, but whilst you're using it, just notice how often it goes wrong. Version 2 operates on generosity, love, and wisdom. And I've looked at the reviews, and it seems a lot easier to use, and it seems to be more compatible with other systems. So I'm in the process of attempting to uninstall and reinstall my operating system, and it seems to be going all right so far. It's not without its hiccups, though. In giving a little bit of a flippant answer to this question, it's probably a good idea to get a clear sense of what self is. So your self-view and your worldview, because they're made as one, they're made together. Self is your expectations about the parts of the universe you identify with. And your worldview is your expectations about everything that you don't identify with. And maybe we could go through like a little life story. So when you're first born until you're about 1 or 2, your sense of self is provided by your mother. Well, hopefully it is anyway. Psychologists tend to relate to a mother and a child under 2 as a single entity. They don't see them as 2 separate people. It makes more sense to treat the both of them than trying to treat one of them. A sense of identity, it's sort of borrowed from your mum. And you probably don't remember that time because that identity is so alien to you now that it's not really of any use to your conscious identity anymore. So you probably have little or no memory of that. At about 2 years old to 3 years old, you realise that your mum isn't you. So your brain develops to the point where you can actually distinguish that there are different people in the world, that you are an individual and that she is an individual. And so you realise that all of a sudden you don't have an identity. You don't see you as the same person as her, And that is as scary as hell. So that's separation anxiety. That's horror and nightmares and chaos and fear and tantrums. It's a really scary experience to go through. But from sort of 3 or 4 onwards, you start the long journey of creating an identity for yourself and creating an understanding of the world. And those two things run concurrently. And it's really important that you do this. If you're denied a relation with a mother when you're a baby, or if you're not given adequate guidance and support when you're 4 years old, that's not a good state to be in at all. But from 4 onwards, you start working out what you like and what you dislike, and you can have quite strong opinions about that. And you define the world, who these people are, who those people are, what these people are like and what they do, what that thing does, how to use it. You know, my mum's telling me I'm the sort of person who brushes my teeth every night, and I don't quite agree with that, so I'm going to say no, but then she's very insistent, and what do I do about that, and how do I negotiate my own boundaries? And it's a sort of clumsy sense of self. It's a very crude sense of self at 4. And that carries on, and things kind of meander a little bit, and maybe you update the fact that you can now ride a bike. And then at puberty, again, you get another situation where instead of it being your brain that develops, which happens in the first cataclysmic loss of identity at 2 years old, it's now your body that changes. And at puberty, your self-image is shattered completely. You're not who you were. You don't relate to people the way you once did. You change physically. Your social perspective changes. You change psychologically. And of course, you feel mortally, excruciatingly insecure at that time. It's totally reasonable too. The identity that you've lived in, your familiar emotions and responses, the familiar family unit, the house, the world, the way things are, even your body is taken from you. Your body does more things, your hormones are all over the place. You're now participating in a more sexualized world. You're probably embarrassed about your parents. And you're much, much more potent now. You're increasingly in a world where people will judge you. Where there's law, you're subject to laws more and more. You can make babies and you can accidentally or intentionally kill people. The stakes are a lot higher with this identity. And if the identity that you create is not in touch with reality at this age, you've got a really serious problem. And of course, to some degree, it will be in touch with reality, and to some degree, it won't be. But the more that it is, the easier that transition will be. And so you get this little sequence given to you through the fact that you have a developing mind and a developing body, a physically developing mind. Let's say you get different capacities as you get older. So you get a birth of an identity, which is your mother's identity. You get the death of that identity, and then you get the birth of your own very held and very safe little identity that's in a little world of your family unit, hopefully. So that's another birth. And then you get death at puberty, and then you're left to cobble together an identity after that. And to do that requires love and effort and skill and honesty and a lot of observation, really looking at what your inclinations are, really looking at what your values are, really looking at your boundaries, really looking at what things make you tick. And often those things that make you tick are not the things that you want to make you tick. And so a sense of self is not a bad thing. It's an absolutely essential thing for you to function in the world. It's really important that you have an identity. What's important is that your identity is based on observable experience and that you're not attached to your identity, so that you're willing to change it in light of new experience. If you can do that, then identity is an asset. And that's exactly what the Buddha did. He had expectations about the world. He just wasn't attached to the expectations. So when he was hungry, he got his alms bowl and he went and stood outside the houses of the local village. Now that requires him to have a self-view, that he understands that he is inhabiting the image of bhikkhu or monk because he's wearing these robes, and that communicates something to people, that he's on an alms round, and he understands that if he does that in front of a building, anybody who lives in there, they might open the door and they might give him food. He had a conception of himself and a conception of the world. You would have to have both those things to be able to do that, to be able to feed himself. He didn't stand in front of a tree with his alms bowl. He didn't stand in front of a house with the bowl on his head. He behaved in a particular way in some expectation of an outcome. But the difference with the Buddha is, if he went to every single house and not a single person gave him any food, he wouldn't be pissed off. He wouldn't be offended. He wouldn't be angry to any of the people. He'd simply take in all the information that was there, and the information would be maybe a rumbly tummy. Maybe he would ask some people around the village if food was short here, or if they didn't know the customs. Who knows? I don't know exactly what he would do, obviously, but that the world did not conform to his understanding, he wouldn't hold a grudge about it in any way. He'd just update his understanding and then act accordingly. The process of identity is often related to in terms of spiritual death and spiritual rebirth, where an old identity fades away and you create a new identity more in line with reality. Well, hopefully more in line with reality. It could be less in line with reality, of course, in which case you've taken quite a significant step back. You're even more susceptible to suffering if you do that. But hopefully we update it based on actual lived direct experience and not on speculation or naive hope. Or on pessimism. Sometimes we can update our identity on pessimism, and that doesn't help either. Kind of rationally we acknowledge that things are impermanent, and therefore we might take a nihilistic bent, let's say. And sort of technically there is something a little bit more in line with reality, but it's a kind of cold or dead or inhuman new identity, where we negate meaning in some way. When we recreate that identity, it's a very pivotal time. And the bit that's in the middle between death and rebirth, the bit where we don't quite know who we are, it's usually quite uncomfortable, but it's very, very potent, very creative. That's called the bardo, the in-between state. And particularly to begin with, because identity is very rigid, it's like a big heavy weight that you're trying to push along, and you push it really, really hard and it doesn't move, and then it sort of jolts forward and it's quite dramatic, and it moves a bit and then stops, and then you have to reposition yourself and push it again. And to begin with, it really is like death and rebirth, and those are the times where you've got quite a heavy, rigid sense of identity. But as your relationship to identity softens up, it's a bit like having that heavy weight, maybe reducing the weight of it, or maybe putting it on a slippy surface, and so you can just keep moving it, and so it takes less effort to move that identity onwards, to sort of change it, let's say. And the ideal, in some sense, could be envisaged as every moment there is spiritual death, and every moment there is spiritual rebirth. Every moment you are letting go of who you have been, and every moment you are creating a new, fresh person to engage with this particular moment. The resolution of your identity becomes so adaptable, so intuitive, that you can very freely respond to anything that's happening in the moment. You could say that being enlightened is not losing your identity, it's actually gaining any identity. It's gaining every identity. It's being totally free to inhabit any way of being that best serves you and the beings around you.